So this lesson is about the absorption of the products of digestion. So here is a transverse section of the ileum. So the products of digestion are absorbed across the ileum epithelium into the bloodstream. So the ileum, remember, is another word for the small intestine. So across the ileum epithelium into the bloodstream. So depending on what the monomer is, depends on how it is absorbed across the epithelial membrane. So monosaccharides, glucose is absorbed by active transport with sodium ions via a co-transport protein. So you probably did this back in Unit 2 when you did active transport, because it's a very good example of that. Galactose is absorbed in the same way using the same co-transporter proteins. However, fructose is slightly different. It's absorbed by facilitated diffusion through a different type of transporter protein. So glucose is co-transport, galactose is co-transport, both involving sodium ions. Fructose is by facilitated diffusion. So now looking at the products of lipid digestion, so monoglycerides and fatty acids. So we talked about micelles last time. So micelles are basically a bit of bile with the monoglycerides and fatty acids. So the micelles move towards the epithelium. But because micelles are constantly breaking and reformed, when they get to the epithelium, they'll actually release the monoglycerides and fatty acids, allowing them to be absorbed. So that the whole micelle itself isn't absorbed. It's just when the micelles release the monoglycerides and the fatty acids, then they get absorbed. And because monoglycerides and fatty acids are lipid soluble, they can just diffuse directly across the epithelial cell membrane. So amino acids, they are absorbed in a very similar way to glucose and galactose, i.e. by active transport, co-transport with sodium ions. So the sodium ions are actively transported out of the epithelial cells into the ileum itself. They then diffuse back into the cells through the sodium-dependent transporter proteins, and at the same time into the epithelial cell membranes, and at the same time they will carry the amino acid with them. So looking back at Unit 2, you did the example with glucose. So what happens is the sodium ions are actively transported out of the epithelial cells into the ileum by the sodium-potassium pump. So therefore there's a concentration gradient now. There's lots of sodium in the ileum, not as many here. So then they will diffuse back down the concentration gradient back into the epithelial cell. And at the same time as doing that, they will also carry the glucose with them into the epithelial cell. That's why it's called co-transport. So it does it by a co-transporter protein. And then the final stage is that now, because there's lots of glucose in the epithelial cell, more so than in the blood, there's a higher concentration of glucose in the epithelial than in the blood. So it goes via a protein by facilitated diffusion. So first step is the sodium is actively transported out of the epithelial cell into the ileum via sodium-potassium pump. Because now you've got a high concentration of sodium in the lumen of the ileum, there's now a concentration gradient. So the sodium moves from its high concentration to its low concentration down a concentration gradient. But at the same time as it does that, it also carries glucose with it. So that's what's known as co-transport, because they're transporting together, and it happens via a co-transporter protein. And then once the glucose has been co-transported into the epithelial cell, there's now lots of glucose in the epithelial cell, so therefore there's less in the blood, so there's a concentration gradient there. So the glucose goes down its concentration gradient by a facilitated diffusion using a protein here. So amino acids happen in the same way, but instead of glucose being co-transported, it's the amino acids are co-transported. So that's it for today.